The morning they traded Marcella Gentry like a parcel of land. The sky over the New Mexico territory was the color of an old bruised purple at the edges and sick yellow toward the center. And she stood in the courtyard of her father's ranch with her hands folded in front of her, listening to men decide the course of her life, as though she were not standing right there in the dust. It was the spring of 1874, and the territory was a tangle of competing claims, ranchers pushing hard against the last open ranges, Apache bands trying to hold what little ground remained theirs, and the federal government issuing paper promises that dried up faster than rain in July. Marcella's father, Hector Gentry, was not a cruel man in the way that some men are cruel, with fists and whiskey and deliberate intention. He was cruel in the quieter way, the way of men who love the idea of a thing more than the thing itself, who see a daughter and think asset, who look at a problem and reach for whatever tool is closest. And on that particular morning, the tool he reached for was Marcella. She was 22 years old, with dark hair that she kept pinned back in a practical knot and brown eyes that missed very little. She had spent the better part of her life on that ranch outside of Socorro, learning to read weather from cloud formations and to read men from the set of their shoulders. She could rope a calf, keep accounts in 2 ledgers simultaneously, and recite scripture from memory, though she had long since stopped believing that scripture had much to say about the particular injustices visited upon women in the New Mexico territory in the year of our Lord 1874. The trouble had begun 3 weeks earlier, when a party of Chiricahua Apache had made a sweeping raid through the southern pastures of the Gentry spread, taking 30 head of cattle and leaving behind 2 dead ranch hands whose names were Domingo Reyes and Carl Fitch. Marcella had helped wrap those men in canvas herself, because the women who worked in the ranch house were too frightened to do it, and she believed that a man deserved to be handled with dignity when he left the world, even if the world had not offered him much dignity while he was in it. The raid had left Hector Gentry furious and frightened in equal measure. He had ridden to Socorro and sent a telegram to the territorial authorities, but the cavalry response had been slow and noncommittal, and in the meantime, Hector had made contact with a rancher named Dale Whitmore, who controlled the largest spread in the region and who had, through 20 years of negotiation, bribery, and ruthlessness, cultivated a fragile working relationship with the Apache band led by a man named Cachillo Rojo. Or Red Knife in the English, the Apache had learned to speak in pieces and fragments during long years of contact with settlers and soldiers. What Hector needed from Whitmore was protection, or at least the cessation of raids against Gentry land. What Whitmore needed from Hector was something Hector had and Whitmore wanted, and the 2 men had arrived, through the particular logic of ambitious, land-hungry men, at a bargain that involved Marcella. She would go to Whitmore's ranch. She would become, in some vague and terrible way that neither man seemed entirely willing to specify directly, a part of Whitmore's household. In exchange, Whitmore would extend his Apache negotiations to cover Gentry land, and Hector Gentry's cattle would graze in peace. Marcella had heard this arrangement described in careful, euphemistic language the night before in her father's study, where she had not been invited but had pressed her ear to the door and listened anyway. She had gone to bed with her jaw tight and her mind working. She had not slept. She had risen before dawn and gone to the kitchen and made coffee, and sat with it cooling in front of her, while the sky went from black to that sick purple and yellow, and by the time her father came to fetch her in his good boots and his pressed shirt, she had already made 2 decisions. The first was that she would not cry. The second was that she would find a way out of this, because no paper and no handshake between men had ever carried her signature, and whatever they thought they were not trading her. Dale Whitmore's ranch was called the Broken Spur, which Marcella thought was an apt name for a place built on broken things. It sat 12 miles east of Socorro, at the end of a road that was barely a road, cutting through scrub and red rock, and the occasional stand of juniper that looked like it had given up on growing taller. She arrived in Whitmore's wagon, driven by one of his hands, with a single trunk of belongings that her father had packed as though she were going to boarding school and not to a life she had not chosen. Whitmore himself met her in the yard, and he was not what she had expected. She had expected a man of her father's type, soft in the middle, hard in the eyes, wearing his ambition openly. Whitmore was those things, but he was also older than she had realized, closer to 60 than 50, with a wife who had died 3 years prior, and a look about him that she recognized, after a moment of searching, as loneliness curdled into something possessive. He was not planning to be kind to her. He was planning to own her, in whatever way a man could own a woman without the law explicitly naming it what it was. She was shown to a room in the main house, which was larger and better furnished than the Gentry ranch house. There were curtains on the windows and a braided rug on the floor and a washstand with a real ceramic basin. Under other circumstances, she might have appreciated it. As it was, she set her trunk against the wall and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the 2 decisions she had made and began working on a third. The third decision was still unformed when she heard horses in the yard on her second morning at the Broken Spur. She looked through the curtain and saw a group of riders coming in from the south, and among them was a man on a gray horse who held himself differently from the others, not with Whitmore's puffed-up authority or the slouching ease of the hired hands, but with a kind of careful steadiness, as though he were always measuring the ground before he put his weight on it. He was broad-shouldered and lean, somewhere in his early 30s, with sun-darkened skin and light brown hair that needed cutting, and a jaw that suggested he was doing a great deal of thinking right now, and none of it was pleasant. His name, she would learn in the next hour, was Arthur Ralston, and he was the man Whitmore had brought in from Texas to help manage the negotiations with Cuchillo Rojo's band. A man who spoke enough Apache to be useful, who had spent 4 years as a scout for the cavalry before deciding that the cavalry's approach to the problem of the Apache was one he could no longer in good conscience support, and who had since been making a modest living as an intermediary, a go-between. A man who sat on the uncertain ground between worlds and tried to keep people from killing each other. Marcella watched him dismount from the gray horse, and she watched him listen to something Whitmore said, and she watched his expression change in a way that was quick and then controlled, a flash of something dark, and then the careful steadiness again. She could not hear what Whitmore said. She would find out soon enough. She found out that afternoon, when Arthur Ralston knocked on the door of her room. She opened it, and he stood in the hallway with his hat in his hands, not a performative gesture, she thought, but a genuine one. And he looked at her with those steady, measuring eyes, and he said, "Miss Gentry, I wonder if I might have a word with you." She stepped back and let him in, which was not entirely proper, but she was past caring about what was proper. She sat in the chair by the window, and he stood near the door, and they looked at each other for a moment with the frank assessment of 2 people who both suspect they are in the same bad situation. "Whitmore told me this morning what the terms of the arrangement with your father include," he said. His voice was low and even, with a Texas drawl smoothed almost away by years of moving from place to place. "He was explaining it to me as though it were a point of pride. He said you were part of the treaty terms." "That is what I understood also," Marcella said. He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know that I will not honor that term." She felt something shift in her chest, not relief, not yet, because she had learned not to trust too quickly, but something, a small unlocking. She kept her face neutral and said, "What exactly do you mean by that?" "I mean that I am not going to help broker a deal that treats a human being as a piece of the transaction," he said. "I've spent 4 years watching the government make arrangements that nobody on the actual receiving end agreed to. I'm not going to be part of doing the same thing to a woman who didn't ask to be here." Marcella looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Ralston," she said at last, "those are admirable words. but I would be grateful if you could tell me what you actually intend to do, because words, in my experience, have a way of being much more available than actions." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one. "That's fair," he said. "I intend to get you out of this arrangement. I don't yet know exactly how, but I am working on it. I wanted you to know where I stand before I start working." "And what do you want in return?" she asked, because she had learned that men who offered things always wanted something. He looked briefly, as though the question surprised him. Then he settled back into that steadiness and said, "Nothing. I just don't want to do something I'll regret." She studied him for another moment, reading the set of his shoulders and the way he held his hat and the fact that his eyes met hers without flinching or sliding away toward something else. "All right, Mr. Ralston," she said. "Tell me what you need from me to make this plan of yours work." "Give me 2 days," he said, "and don't let Whitmore know that you and I have spoken about this." 2 days, she agreed. He nodded, put his hat back on his head, and left. She sat by the window for a long time after that, watching the yard below, watching him cross to the barn with that careful, deliberate stride. And for the first time since her father had told her what he had arranged, she felt something that was not quite hope but was at least in the direction of it. The 2 days were not easy. Whitmore had a way of filling a room that Marcella found suffocating, not with noise, but with expectation. He would come to the dining table at meals and talk about his land, his plans, the cattle he intended to buy in the fall, the room he was thinking of adding to the house, the improvements he intended to make, and all of it was spoken in a tone that included her in these plans without asking whether she wished to be included. She ate her meals and listened and responded with the minimum required by politeness, and watched the clock, and thought about Arthur Ralston working on something in the 2-day window he had asked for. She saw him briefly at supper on the first night, seated at the far end of Whitmore's long table with 2 of the other hands. He did not look at her directly, but she had the sense of being aware of him the way you are aware of something solid in a dark room, by the space it occupies, by the specific quality of its presence. He ate quietly and talked a little with the men beside him and excused himself early, and she could not tell from his face how the work was going. On the second afternoon, one of the household women, a Mexican woman named Petra who had worked at the Broken Spur for 6 years and who had a way of moving through the world with her eyes taking in everything, came to Marcella's room with fresh towels and lingered at the door after setting them down and said quietly, "There is a man waiting at the back of the barn. He says he would be grateful if you could come." Marcella put on her hat and walked through the kitchen and out the back and around to the barn, and there was Arthur Ralston in the shade of the wide eave, with 2 horses saddled and ready, and a canvas bag strapped to the back of the gray. She stopped and looked at him. "I talked to Cachillo Rojo's people this morning," he said, without preamble, "through a man named Severo who carries messages for them. The actual raid on your father's property was done by a younger faction who acted without Cachillo Rojo's sanction. He has already pulled them back, and there won't be another raid on Gentry land, regardless of what Whitmore told your father." Whitmore knew this. He used the threat of raids that were already over to extract a concession from your father that he had been working toward for a long time. Marcella felt the specific heat of that information move through her anger at Whitmore, anger at her father for being deceived, and underneath both of those, a cold, clarifying certainty about what she had suspected from the beginning. "So the arrangement was built on a lie," she said. "Most of the arrangements out here are built on lies," he said. "But yes, this particular one more than most." He paused. "I also spoke with your father this morning. I rode out to the Gentry ranch at first light." She stared at him. "You spoke to my father?" "I told him what I'm telling you, that the raid threat was already resolved, that Whitmore had deceived him, and that the arrangement involving you was built on a false premise and needed to be dissolved." He looked at her steadily. He wasn't happy to hear it, but he's not a man who wants to be publicly embarrassed, and once he understood that the truth of this could come out in ways that would damage him, he agreed to withdraw from the arrangement. "And Whitmore? Whitmore is angry, Arthur said simply. He'll stay angry for a while, but he's not stupid enough to make an enemy of me openly, because he still needs my help with the actual negotiations that matter, and he knows it. He paused again. He won't give me any more trouble, and he won't give you any either. Marcella looked at the two saddled horses. You brought two horses, she said. I thought you might not want to ride back in Whitmore's wagon, he said. I'm heading toward Socorro myself. I can take you as far as the main road or farther if you prefer. She was quiet for a moment. The afternoon sun was coming at an angle that turned the dust in the yard to something close to gold, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark was working through its full repertoire with great confidence, and Marcella Gentry stood in the shadow of the barn eave and looked at this man who had done what he said he was going to do, and felt the careful unlocking in her chest open a little further. I'd prefer farther, she said. I don't particularly want to go back to my father's house either. He looked at her steadily. Where would you prefer to go? I don't know yet, she admitted, but I'll figure it out on the road. I've always been better at thinking when I'm moving. Something in his expression shifted that not-quite smile again, warmer this time. Then let's move, he said, and held the reins of the second horse out to her. She took them and mounted with the easy practice of a woman who had been riding since she was 6, and they rode out of the broken spur yard without looking back, and not a soul came out to stop them, and the meadowlark kept singing behind them as they put the broken spur at their backs. They rode for the first hour in companionable silence, which was something Marcella appreciated more than she could immediately articulate. She had spent the last 3 days in the company of men who spoke constantly, filling every silence with the sound of their own importance, and the quiet that Arthur Ralston was comfortable with felt like water to someone who had been going without. The landscape opened out around them, the long, flat stretches of the Rio Grande Valley, with the Magdalena Mountains to the west going blue in the distance, and the scrub stretching in every direction, punctuated by yucca and ocotillo, and the occasional red sandstone outcropping. It was beautiful in the stark, unadorned way that this part of the territory always was, beautiful in a way that did not ask for your approval or your comfort. How did you learn to speak Apache? She asked, when they were well clear of the broken spur and the road ahead was empty. He rode for a moment before answering. I was a scout for the Army out of Fort Stanton from 1869 to 1873, he said. The Mescalero Apache were on the reservation at Chilarosa then, or supposed to be. I spent a lot of time in the field with Apache scouts who were working with the Army. I learned as much as they were willing to teach me, which was more than most of the officers bothered to learn. He paused. Eventually, I couldn't do the work anymore. The things the Army was being ordered to do in those years, the way the reservation terms kept shifting, the way promises got made and then broken before the ink was dry. I had too many conversations with too many people who had been told something was one way and then found it was completely another. I resigned my commission in '73 and started doing this instead. Intermediary work, she said. For want of a better word. Sometimes it amounts to something. Sometimes it doesn't. He looked at the road ahead. Today it amounted to something. She looked at him sideways. It did, she agreed quietly. I want to say thank you properly, Mr. Ralston. Not just for what you did today, but for the way you did it. You asked me what I needed before you started. You told me what you were going to do and then you did it. That is not a common combination. He was quiet for a moment. I was in a situation once where someone else decided my life for me, he said. Not the same as yours, but the same shape of thing. Someone thought they had the right to arrange my future because it was convenient for them. He paused. I know what that feels like. I wasn't going to add to it. She wanted to ask him more about that, the shape of it, what had happened, who had done it, but she had a sense that it was a door he had opened a crack and she should not push. There would be other conversations, she thought, and then caught herself thinking it and examined the assumption, other conversations, as though their roads were going the same direction for more than just today. What will you do now? He asked. You said you didn't want to go back to your father's. I don't, she said. My father and I will need to have a conversation eventually, and I intend to have it, but not today and not on his terms. I need some ground to stand on first. Is there someone else you could stay with? In Socorro, she thought about it. There's a woman named Grace Holt who runs the millinery on Manzanares Street. She and my mother were close before my mother passed. She's offered before. She paused. I never took her up on it because going to her would have meant admitting I needed to leave, and I wasn't ready to do that. Are you ready now? She thought about the courtyard that morning 3 days ago, about the sky like a bruise, about her father's good boots. I think being traded like livestock has a way of clarifying things, she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but carried some warmth. I imagine it would. They reached Socorro in the late afternoon. The town spread out along the Rio Grande with its church and its adobe buildings, and its one main street that served as the axis of whatever passed for civilization in this part of the territory. It was a town Marcella had known all her life, had bought flour and thread, and occasionally a novel from its stores, had attended its dances and its church services and its funerals. And it looked different now, coming into it on her own terms without her father's wagon, beside a man who had chosen to ride with her rather than against her. She found Grace Holt's house behind the millinery and knocked on the door, and Grace opened it and looked at Marcella and then at the man on the gray horse behind her and then back at Marcella and said, "Well, come in then. I'll put on coffee and you can tell me all of it." Arthur Ralston tipped his hat. "I'll see to the horses and leave you to it, Miss Gentry." "Thank you," she said. And then, because she could see him preparing to ride off into the remainder of the afternoon without any clear arrangement for when they might speak again, she added, "Will you still be in Socorro in the morning?" He looked at her with those steady eyes. "I'll be at the hotel on California Street," he said. "If there's anything further I can do." "I'll find you tomorrow," she said, "if that's agreeable." "It's agreeable," he said, and rode toward the livery, and she went inside and sat at Grace Holt's kitchen table and let the older woman put coffee in front of her and said, "I have a great deal to tell you," and meant it in more ways than one. Grace Holt was a small woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and a manner that was brisk and loving in equal measure, and she listened to the whole account: the raid, Hector's arrangement, Whitmore, Arthur Ralston, the horses, the road, without interrupting once, which was a form of respect Marcella had rarely received when telling a story. Marcella was finished. Grace was quiet for a moment and then said, "Your mother would have been furious with your father." "Yes," Marcella said, "she would have been furious with him for a great many things." "And this Ralston man," Grace said, turning her cup in her hands, "what is he like aside from being useful?" Marcella considered the question with more care than might have been strictly necessary. "He's careful," she said at last. "He thinks before he says a thing. He did what he said he would do." She paused. "He's been through something that taught him something about what it means to have your life arranged by other people. I don't know what it was yet." Grace looked at her with the eyes that missed nothing. "Yet," she said. "I'm seeing him tomorrow," Marcella said, which was not, she supposed, an answer to anything Grace had said, and yet it seemed to satisfy Grace, who poured more coffee and changed the subject with the tact of a woman who had been managing other people's emotions for a long time. The following morning was clear and cool, with the smell of spring coming off the mountains to the east, and Marcella walked to the hotel on California Street with her hair pinned neatly and her boots clean, and found Arthur Ralston in the small dining room off the lobby, eating eggs and reading what appeared to be a densely printed government document of some kind. He stood when she came in, which she noted. A lot of men did not. "Good morning," he said. "Would you like breakfast?" "I ate at Grace's," she said. "But I'll sit with you while you finish yours." He sat back down and she sat across from him, and the waitress brought her coffee without being asked, which she appreciated. They talked for an hour, the way people talk when they are genuinely interested in each other, and not yet sure how much to show it, carefully and with humor, and with occasional moments of unexpected honesty that made both of them go quiet for a beat. She asked him about the document he had been reading, and he told her it was the new draft of the reservation terms being negotiated with the Chiricahua, and he told her what was wrong with them in specific and technical terms that surprised her, not because she was not capable of understanding them, but because she had rarely had a man speak to her about a complex political subject without first checking whether she was following along. He seemed to take her intelligence entirely for granted, in the best way. She told him about the ranch, about growing up working the land with her father before her mother died and after, about keeping the accounts and learning to negotiate with suppliers because her father was not good at negotiation, and she was. She told him about the books she had read, the collection she had ordered through the general store, the novels and the history, and the one volume of poetry that she kept because her mother had underlined certain passages in pencil. "Which passages?" he asked. She looked at him. "You want to know which passages my mother underlined?" "I do," he said simply. She thought about it. "There's a poem by Tennyson," she said. "My mother underlined the line, 'I am a part of all that I have met.' She put 2 lines under it." He looked at her with an expression that was not readable in the usual way, but that had something in it she recognized as a man turning a thought over and finding it significant. "That's a good line to underline," he said. "She was a good reader," Marcella said. They sat with that for a moment, and the morning light came through the dining room window and lay on the table between them like something solid. He told her, that morning, about the thing that had given him the shape of understanding he had mentioned on the road. He had been engaged to be married when he was 24, a woman in San Antonio, a proper engagement with a ring and a date and families who had shaken hands over it. Her family had decided, while he was away on his first extended cavalry deployment, that a better match had presented itself, and they had made the arrangements without consulting either Arthur or the young woman, whose name had been Caroline. By the time he returned, Caroline had been married for 6 weeks to a man 15 years her senior who owned a cotton merchant business and could offer the kind of financial stability that an Army scout could not. He had not blamed Caroline. He had blamed the particular logic of the world that said her wishes and his wishes were the least important part of the equation. "I thought about that for a long time," he said. "About how it felt to come back and find that my life had been rearranged in my absence and I had no recourse. And I thought about how much worse it is when you're a woman, and that's not an exception that happens once but the entire system you're living inside of." Marcella looked at him steadily. "That is a perceptive thing for a man to have thought," she said. "I had 4 years of long rides and not much else to do but think," he said. She smiled at that, and he saw the smile and the expression on his face was the one people have when they realize that something they have been waiting for has arrived, and they do not quite know what to do with the fact of it yet. Over the following 2 weeks, Arthur Ralston stayed in Socorro and Marcella stayed with Grace Holt, and they found reasons to be in each other's company that were at first practical. He needed to know more about the local ranching politics for the ongoing negotiations. She needed someone to help her understand the legal aspects of the arrangement her father had made, and whether she had any standing to formally object to it. And then became less practical and more simply the desire to be in the same space. They walked along the Rio Grande in the evenings, when the light was long and the cottonwoods along the bank were coming into leaf, that particular yellow-green that cottonwoods wear in spring like something new and tentative. He told her about Texas, about the hill country north of San Antonio where he had grown up, about his mother who had been a school teacher and his father who had been a poor farmer and neither of them bitter about it. She told him about her own mother, a woman from Santa Fe named Rosa who had spoken both English and Spanish with equal ease and had raised Marcella to do the same, and who had died of a fever when Marcella was 15. Leaving a gap in the Gentry household that Hector had tried to fill with business and activity, and had never quite managed. "She sounds like someone I would have liked," Arthur said, on an evening when they were sitting on the bank and the river was making its low, constant sound beside them. "She would have liked you," Marcella said. She had a gift for identifying people who were trying to actually live right versus people who were just trying to appear to. She paused. It would have put you in the first category quickly. He looked at the river. I'm not always sure I deserve to be there, he said. I have not always done the right thing. There are years of my life where I was part of a system that did enormous harm, and I knew it was doing harm and kept going because I told myself my individual contribution to the negotiation side could offset the worst of what was being done on the military side. I'm not sure that was true. What made you finally leave? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. There was a winter camp, he said. I won't give you the details because they're not good details. But there was a camp, and there was an action the cavalry took against it on orders I had advised against, and afterward I looked at what had happened and I could not find any frame that made my presence in that situation justified. So I left. She sat with that. I think recognizing when you can no longer justify a thing and then actually stopping is rarer than people think, she said. Maybe, he said. But I also think it's only the beginning. Stopping is the easiest part. What comes after is harder. They were sitting close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, and the evening was warm enough that she had taken off her jacket and laid it beside her on the grass. And she was aware of the specific proximity of him in a way that she had been growing more aware of over the past 2 weeks, not anxiously, but attentively, in the way you are attentive to something that matters. Arthur, she said, and then stopped because it was the first time she had used his given name, and she wanted to hear what it sounded like in the air between them. He turned to look at her. Marcella, he said, in the same tone, and the sound of her own name from his mouth was different from the way anyone else had ever said it. I want to ask you something, she said, and I want you to answer me honestly, not kindly. I'll do my best, he said. When you came to my room that first day at the Broken Spur and said you wouldn't honor the term of the arrangement that involved me, was any part of that because of how I look? She said it plainly, because she had thought about it and decided she needed to know, because she had been placed in enough situations where she was assessed for her appearance, and she could not afford to be wrong about this one. He was quiet for a long moment, which she respected because it meant he was actually thinking about it rather than rushing to reassure her. I noticed how you look, he said at last. I would be lying if I said I didn't, but that is not why I came to your room. I came to your room because Whitmore told me about the arrangement with the satisfaction of a man displaying a trophy, and something in me that had been building for a long time just said no. Not this. Not again. He paused. The fact that you are also someone I find that you are. He stopped and started again. You are the most interesting person I have met in years, Marcella. That became apparent in the first 10 minutes of talking to you, but it is not why I helped you. I helped you because it was right. What came after that is something separate. She looked at the river for a moment. All right, she said. That's the honest answer, thank you. What prompted the question, he asked. Experience, she said simply. He nodded and did not press it, and that was also the right response. Hector Gentry came to Socorro on a Tuesday, 2 weeks and 3 days after Marcella's departure from the Broken Spur. She had known he would come eventually, and she had spent some time deciding how she would handle it, and she had arrived at the conclusion that she would handle it directly, in Grace Holt's parlor, with no audience except Grace herself, who had agreed to stay in the room because Marcella trusted her, and because her presence would, she judged, keep the conversation from becoming something her father would later pretend had gone differently than it had. Hector Gentry was a tall man gone a little heavy, with gray at his temples and the look of a man who is accustomed to being the authority in whatever room he inhabits. He came in and sat in the chair Grace offered and looked at his daughter with an expression that was trying to be stern and not quite making it. I owe you an apology, he said after a short silence which surprised her enough that she nearly lost her composure. You do, she said. Whitmore Ralston told me about Whitmore, about what he knew and when he knew it, that I was deceived as he stopped. It does not fully excuse what I agreed to. I understand that. It does not, she said. Even if the threat had been real, You had no right to offer me as a solution to it. I am not a piece of land or a head of cattle, father. I am your daughter and I am a grown woman, and I have never been given any reason to believe that my opinion of my own life matters to you." He flinched. "That's a hard thing to hear." "It is a harder thing to have lived," she said. She felt Grace's presence beside her like a steady anchor and kept her voice level. "I am not going to come back to the ranch in the same way things were before. I am not going to be available to be used as a solution to your problems. If I am going to have a relationship with you that is worth having, it will be one where you see me as a person who makes her own decisions, and you respect those decisions, even when you disagree with them. That is the only arrangement I am willing to enter into." Hector looked at her for a long time. Something in him that had been braced seemed to settle. "You sound like your mother," he said quietly. "Good," she said. He stayed for 2 hours, and it was not a comfortable 2 hours, but it was an honest one, and by the end of it something had shifted in the particular way that things can shift between parents and children when both parties finally speak plainly enough. He would not be transformed overnight. She did not expect that, but a different kind of understanding had been laid between them, like a new foundation, uncertain but real. After he left, Grace put whiskey in both their cups and said, "Well done," and Marcella sat back in her chair and felt something unclench in her chest that had been clenched since the morning of the courtyard and the bruised sky. She went to find Arthur that evening and told him about the conversation, and he listened without interrupting, and when she was done he said, "How do you feel?" "Tired," she said, "and relieved. And like something I was carrying has been set down somewhere, even if I don't know yet what to do with my hands now that they're empty." They were standing on the street outside the hotel in the cooling evening, and the last light was going gold along the tops of the adobe buildings, and he looked at her with an expression that was no longer careful in the way it had been in the beginning, but open in a way that was clearly costing him something. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I have a standing offer to take a position as a federal mediator in Santa Fe," he said. "Working on the treaty negotiations at a more formal level. It's steady work, and it would let me do more of the kind of thing that actually makes a difference. I've been putting off giving them an answer." He paused. "The reason I have been putting it off is that it would mean leaving Socorro, and I have been finding reasons to stay in Socorro, and I think we both know what those reasons are." She looked at him in the gold evening light. "I think we do," she said. "I am not asking you to come with me," he said. "I am not in the business of making plans for other people's lives, but I am asking you what you would want if wanting were the thing that mattered." She was quiet for a moment. The evening was very still. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once and then stopped. "I want to stop having my life decided for me by other people," she said. "And I want—" She stopped and breathed. "I want to go toward something, Arthur. I've been going away from things for a long time. Toward seems better." "Toward Santa Fe?" he asked. His voice was careful, but his eyes were not. "Toward wherever makes sense," she said. "I would like, if it were possible, for wherever makes sense to be the same place you are." She said it plainly, the way she had decided years ago to say hard things, plainly and without ornament, because ornament was just another way of protecting yourself from the consequences of honesty. "I don't know how to make it more complicated than that." He exhaled slowly, and the careful control in his expression dissolved entirely for a moment, and what was underneath it was something that looked like profound relief. "You don't need to make it more complicated," he said. "Simple will do fine." They stood for another moment in the gold light, and then he reached out and took her hand, which was the simplest and most direct thing either of them had done since the moment she had taken the reins of that second horse. And she let him, and the feeling of his hand around hers was the feeling of something arriving that she had been not quite looking for, in the way you do not quite look for things you have decided you probably cannot have. There was more to work out. There was always more to work out, but the working out of it was something they would do together, and that made it a different kind of problem entirely. They spent the weeks that followed in a state of understanding that was new and slightly extraordinary to both of them. He formally gave his answer to the Santa Fe position. She began the process of negotiating a formal financial settlement from her father, her mother's portion of the estate, which Rosa Gentry had specified in writing, and which Hector had never gotten around to distributing, with the help of a lawyer Grace Holt knew in Albuquerque, because Grace knew someone useful in almost every corner of the territory. They rode out together on multiple occasions through that spring country, because the negotiations Arthur was managing required periodic visits to locations north and west of Socorro, and because Marcella had suggested she could help with the organizational and documentation aspects, which she could, and because both of them had realized that they were simply better at most things when the other one was present. One afternoon in early May, they were camped on the banks of a creek north of the town, having ridden out to meet with a man named Severo, who served as a messenger between the formal treaty process and Cachillo Rojo's people. The meeting had gone well better than Arthur had expected, because Marcella had thought to bring a written copy of the previous agreed terms and had noticed an inconsistency between what Severo was being told and what the documents actually said, which she pointed out with the same matter-of-fact precision she brought to everything, and which had resulted in a clarification that might have otherwise taken weeks to unravel. Afterward, they had built a small fire and made coffee because the afternoon was cooling faster than they had expected, and they were sitting beside the creek with the water going soft and constant over the stones, and Arthur looked at her across the fire and said, "Severo asked me this afternoon who you were." "What did you tell him?" she asked. "I told him you were essential," he said. "He seemed to understand that." She looked at him with the fire between them and the creek behind her and the mountains going dark to the west. "Is that what I am?" she said. "To me," he said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Arthur," she said. "Marcella." "I think you should know that I am going to be quite difficult to be with," she said. "I have opinions about most things and I intend to state them. I am not interested in making myself smaller to fit into someone else's shape. I will want to work, properly work, not in a decorative way. I will want to be involved in decisions that affect my life. I will argue with you when I think you are wrong." She paused. "I want you to know all of that clearly before anything is decided." He looked at her with those steady eyes and the firelight on the planes of his face, and he said, "Marcella, I have spent the last month watching you outthink men who have been in this territory their whole lives, argue down a government document with 3 specific clause citations, and sit across from your father and tell him exactly what you required of him without flinching once." He paused. "The version of you that you're describing is the only version I have ever known. I am not interested in a different one." She felt the thing in her chest that had been carefully and tentatively opening move another degree. "All right then," she said quietly. "Good, good," he agreed. The fire popped between them and the creek kept talking and the first stars were beginning to show above the ridge to the east, and they sat there in a silence that was the comfortable, inhabited kind, the kind that takes time to build, and Marcella thought, "I am going toward something. This is what it feels like." He proposed to her in June, in Grace Holt's garden behind the millinery, on a morning when the roses Grace had been cultivating with considerable determination were finally, triumphantly blooming in 3 colors. He did it without ceremony, in the middle of a conversation about something entirely different. They were discussing the provisions list for a trip to Santa Fe, and he simply stopped in the middle of a sentence and said, "Marry me, Marcella. I want to make a life with you. I'm asking you, not telling you, and I will accept whatever answer you give." She looked at him in the morning light among Grace's roses, this man who had knocked on a door in a house she had not wanted to be in, and said he would not honor an unjust term, and said, "Yes, obviously yes. Now finish your thought about the provisions because I want to make sure we bring enough coffee." He laughed, a full, real laugh that she had been hearing more of lately, and that she intended to keep hearing for a long time, and finished his thought. And Grace, who had been listening from behind the kitchen window with absolutely no shame whatsoever, came out and embraced both of them and said she would make a cake. They were married in Socorro in July of 1874, in the small church on the main plaza, with Grace Holt as Marcella's witness, and a man named Tom Birch who had worked with Arthur in his cavalry days as his, and Hector Gentry in the third row, looking like a man who understood that he was present on terms that were not his own, and who was trying, with some visible effort, to be grateful for the invitation. The ceremony was brief, and the language was simple, and when Arthur took her hands in his and spoke the vows in a voice that was low and steady and entirely sure, Marcella felt the last of the clenching in her chest release entirely, like a fist finally opening after a very long time of being held shut. Afterward, Grace served cake on the church steps, and Tom Birch played a fiddle with more enthusiasm than precision, and Hector Gentry shook Arthur's hand with a grip that was too tight and then came to Marcella and said, "I am sorry, Marcella, for what it's worth," and she looked at him and said, "It's worth something, Father." Not all of it, but something, which was more than she had expected to be able to say, and which seemed, from the look on his face, to be more than he had expected to receive. They set out for Santa Fe the following week, with a wagon that Arthur had bought and fitted out, with Marcella's trunk and Arthur's saddle, and a crate of books that she had ordered through the general store over the past 2 months because she had decided that wherever she was going with books. Grace stood on the road outside her house and waved until they turned the corner, and Marcella watched her until the last possible moment, and made a note to write her a letter every 2 weeks without fail, which she would do for the next 30 years. Santa Fe in 1874 was a city that existed at the intersection of several different worlds: the old Spanish colonial order, the newer American territorial authority, the trade routes that had been running north and south and east and west for centuries before any American had arrived to put a name to them. It was dusty and old and complicated and full of argument, and Marcella loved it immediately. They found rooms at first, then a small house on the east side of the city, near the acequia that brought water through the neighborhood, with a garden space that Marcella looked at and immediately began planning in her head. Arthur's work at the federal mediator's office began in August, and within the first month it became apparent that the office was badly organized, and the documentation systems were inadequate, and the written records of previous treaty terms were scattered across 3 different filing systems, none of which talked to the others. Marcella spent 3 weeks asking questions and reading everything she could find, and then sat down with Arthur and the man who ran the office, a federal appointee named William Crane, who was decent enough and overextended, and presented a reorganization proposal so thorough and specific that Crane looked at it for a long time and then said, "Mrs. Ralston, would you be willing to take a formal position here?" She looked at Arthur, who looked back at her with the expression of a man waiting to see what someone he admires is going to do, and said, "What are the terms?" The terms were negotiated. The terms were satisfactory. She took the position, which made her one of the very few women working in an official capacity at a federal territorial office in New Mexico in 1874, a fact that caused a small amount of consternation among certain people, whose consternation Marcella regarded with the patient indifference of someone who has more important things to think about. The work was real, and it was hard, and it mattered, at least some of the time, and for at least some of the people involved, which was about the best you could say for most work in this particular territory in this particular era. There were negotiations that fell apart and had to be rebuilt from the beginning. There were terms that were agreed to and then violated by one side or the other, and then the slow, grinding process of working out what came next. There were moments of genuine progress, small and specific: a water rights agreement that held, a boundary marking that both parties respected, a school established on terms that the community it was meant to serve had actually been consulted about. Arthur came home in the evenings, sometimes lit up with the rare good days and sometimes hollowed out by the bad ones, and Marcella made dinner and listened to all of it and argued with him when she disagreed and agreed with him when he was right and told him when she thought he was being too hard on himself, which was more often than he thought. He came home to her, and she went out in the mornings to work that she had chosen, and between those two facts was a life that felt, most days, like the thing she had been going toward. Their first winter in Santa Fe was cold and dry, and they spent the evenings by the fire with their books and their conversations, and Marcella began to understand that what she had been afraid of, in all those years of watching other women's lives contract around the expectations of the men they were given to, was not love, but the particular version of it that asked you to become less of yourself. This was not that. This was something that made her more of herself, because Arthur Ralston was genuinely curious about the person she was and did not wish her to be a different one. In the spring of 1875, their son was born. They named him Thomas James Ralston Thomas for Tom Birch, who had played the fiddle at their wedding and who had died of pneumonia that winter, a loss that had hit Arthur harder than he showed, and James for Marcella's grandfather, a man she had never met but whose name her mother had spoken with affection. Thomas James Ralston came into the world red-faced and opinionated, which Marcella said was a good sign and Arthur said was a terrifying one, and which both of them secretly thought was perfect. He was a healthy, substantial baby who grew into a substantial, curious child, and both his parents had strong opinions about what he would learn and how he would be raised, and the only real arguments they had in those early years of parenthood were about education, because Marcella thought the available schooling in Santa Fe was inadequate, and Arthur thought she was right but wasn't sure what to do about it, and she told him she intended to do something about it herself, which she did. Because she was Marcella Ralston, and doing something about inadequate situations was her particular form of motion. She organized, over the course of the following year, a small but serious reading group for the children of several families in their neighborhood, which met 3 afternoons a week at the Ralston house, and eventually expanded to include adults as well, because the adults wanted to come, and she saw no reason to exclude them. It was not a school in any official sense, but it was education, and it was conducted with the same precision and intentionality she brought to everything. And several children who passed through it went on to proper schooling in Albuquerque and Denver, and in one case back east, and Marcella received letters from some of them for years afterward that she kept in a box in the study. Hector Gentry died in 1877, 3 years after the wedding, of a heart condition he had apparently had for longer than anyone knew and had not told anyone about, which was entirely in character. He died at the ranch outside Socorro, and Marcella and Arthur made the journey for the funeral and stood at the grave in the April heat, and Marcella cried, which surprised her slightly, not for the man he had been to her, but for the man she had sometimes glimpsed underneath the other one, the man who had shaken hands too hard at her wedding, because he was trying to say something he didn't have the language for, the man who had said "you sound like your mother" and meant it as the best thing he knew how to offer. She received her mother's portion of the estate, finally and formally, and used the money to purchase a small plot of land at the edge of Santa Fe, which she held for several years while deciding what to do with it. Arthur was appointed in 1876 to a more senior position with the Federal Mediation Office, which meant more travel and more weight, but also more actual authority over the outcomes of negotiations, which made the travel and the weight worth it. He was gone for stretches of several weeks at a time, to Tucson and Albuquerque and occasionally further, and during those absences, Marcella ran the house and managed Thomas James, and kept her reading group going and worked at the office on the days when her own responsibilities there required her presence. And they wrote to each other with the regularity and depth of people who have discovered that letters are a good way of knowing what you actually think, because writing requires you to finish a thought. His letters were precise and observant and occasionally very funny, because Arthur Ralston in writing had a dry wit that expressed itself in long, rolling sentences that built slowly toward a point that was often unexpected. Hers were direct and detailed, and tended to include diagrams when she was explaining something spatial, which he teased her about and kept every single one of. Their second child came in 1878, a daughter they named Rosa for Marcella's mother, who deserved to have her name spoken again in the world. And Rosa Ralston was from the beginning a different kind of person from her brother, quieter and more watchful, with dark hair and brown eyes like Marcella's, and a habit of observing a situation for a long time before committing to any action, which seemed like excellent judgment to both her parents. By the year 1880, the Ralston household on the east side of Santa Fe was a place of comfortable, purposeful chaos. Thomas James was 5 and had recently become interested in horses with an intensity that his father regarded as natural, and his mother regarded as requiring management, meaning she had already begun teaching him the basics of horse care in order to channel the intensity toward competence rather than enthusiasm unmoored from knowledge. Rosa was 2 and had opinions she expressed at volume. The reading group had grown into something that could fairly be called a school, informal still but consistent, meeting in the Ralston house 5 days a week and serving 12 children of various ages. Marcella used the land she had purchased from her inheritance to build a proper schoolhouse, a single room of adobe with large windows and a covered porch, sited to catch the morning light, and hired 2 additional teachers with the combination of her own money and a grant from the territorial government that she had applied for herself and that William Crane had helped her navigate. The school was not affiliated with any church and not limited by any particular politics, which made it unusual and somewhat controversial and entirely Marcella's. Arthur stood at the door of the finished schoolhouse on the morning it opened and looked at his wife standing in the middle of the room, checking that the desks were arranged the way she wanted them, and felt something that had no simple name. Pride was part of it, and love was most of it, and also a kind of awe at the sheer forward momentum of the person he had married, the way she moved through the world like something that knew its own direction and had no patience for obstacles. She turned and saw him watching her and said, "The desks are slightly uneven. I'm going to need someone to level the floor under the back row." "Good morning to you too," he said. She smiled that particular smile that had been knocking the breath out of him for 6 years now and showed no signs of stopping. "Good morning," she said. "I'm glad you're here." He crossed the room to her. "I wouldn't be anywhere else," he said. She looked up at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because in 6 years they had developed the rare ability to sometimes say necessary things without words. And what passed between them in that moment in the new schoolhouse, with the morning light coming through the large windows, was one of those things. Later, when the children began arriving, and the room filled with noise and movement, and the school was finally begun, Arthur sat on the covered porch and watched through the window as Marcella stood at the front of the room and began the day. And he thought about a morning in 1874 when he had knocked on a door with his hat in his hands, and a woman had opened it and looked at him with eyes that missed nothing, and how everything that had happened since then had happened because he had decided, in the face of an unjust arrangement, to say simply, "I will not honor that term." He was glad every day that he had said it. There were difficult years mixed in with the good ones, because that is the nature of years. In 1881, a drought gripped the territory, and the effects on the farming communities north of Santa Fe were severe, and Arthur's work became more fraught as competing claims on water resources added a new layer of tension to negotiations that were already complicated. Marcella organized a relief effort through the school, collecting and distributing food and supplies to several families whose situations were the worst. She wrote 3 letters to the territorial governor about the need for better water rights frameworks, only one of which received a reply, But the reply led to a meeting, and the meeting led to a policy discussion, and the policy discussion led to changes 2 years later that she was informed about by letter, and which she received with the satisfaction of someone who has learned that the work of change is long and often invisible, and has made peace with that. In 1882, Arthur came home from a trip to Tucson with a story about a young man he had met there. A Mescalero Apache man named Joaquin who was trying to navigate the bureaucratic requirements for a land claim on behalf of his community, and who had been turned away from 3 different federal offices because his documentation was in the wrong form. Arthur had spent 2 days helping him get the documentation right, because it was the right thing to do, and also because he had recognized, in Joaquin's situation, the shape of every unjust arrangement he had ever been part of or witnessed or been moved to act against. The claim was eventually approved. Arthur considered it one of the better 2 days he had spent in a decade of work. Marcella listened to the whole story and then said, "You know, we should think about whether there's something more systematic we can do about people being turned away because of documentation failures. The people who most need access to these offices are often the people with the least capacity to meet the paperwork requirements." Arthur looked at her. "I was just going to say that." "I know," she said. "We often arrive at the same places. You just take longer to get there." He threw a piece of bread at her across the supper table, which Thomas James, who was now 7, found hilarious, and Rosa, who was 4, solemnly picked up the bread and ate it, and the evening dissolved into the kind of comfortable hilarity that good homes produce regularly. They began a 3rd child that winter, and in the fall of 1883 their 2nd son was born. They named him Henry, after no one in particular, but because both of them liked the sound of it, and it seemed like a name that could hold whatever kind of person chose to fill it up. Henry Ralston was from his first weeks a cheerful, amiable child with Arthur's brown hair, and a temperament that his mother described as profoundly reasonable, which was her highest compliment. He slept well and ate well and grew well, and regarded the world with a kind of sunny equanimity that made everyone around him calmer. Thomas James, at 8, appointed himself Henry's protector, with a solemnity that both parents found endearing, and which Rosa, at 5, regarded as unnecessary interference in her own prior claim to the position of most important sibling. The Ralston house on those evenings, supper on the table that Marcella had bought at a market 7 years ago, the 3 children at various stages of their meals, Arthur talking about the day's work, Marcella talking about the school, the lamplight warm and steady, the sounds of the city outside the window, was a thing that neither of them took for granted, because both of them knew what it had cost to build it and on what terms it had been built. Terms they had both agreed to, freely and with their eyes open. In the summer of 1884, 10 years after the morning of the bruised sky and the courtyard in Socorro, Marcella stood in the garden of their house, not the small plot of rented rooms they had started with, but the proper house they had bought 3 years ago, with a garden that now had roses and herbs and a kitchen plot that produced more tomatoes than they could eat, and which Thomas James was officially responsible for, a responsibility he took more seriously than he took almost anything else, and thought about what it meant to have arrived at a life. She had not thought, when she had been standing in her father's courtyard in the spring of 1874, with men arranging her future around her, that arriving anywhere good was possible. She had not thought, in those first days at the Broken Spur, that the knock on her door was the beginning of anything except perhaps an exit, which was itself more than she had expected. She had not thought, riding out of the Broken Spur yard on the 2nd horse beside a man she barely knew, that she was riding toward 10 years of this, toward the school and the children and the letters and the suppers and the long evenings by the fire, and all the 1,000 ordinary and extraordinary moments that made up a life being lived on terms you had chosen. Arthur came out to the garden and stood beside her, because he had a habit of finding her wherever she was without being told, which she had stopped remarking on because it was simply a fact of their life together, like the way he always made sure the coffee was ready in the morning and the way she always knew when he was troubled before he said a word. "Penny for your thoughts," he said. "I was thinking about arrivals," she said, "and departures, and what it takes to get from one to the other." He stood beside her and looked at the garden. "Any conclusions?" "Several," she said, "the main one being that it helps to have someone traveling in the same direction." He looked at her, that look, the one that was still, a decade on, the same look he had had in the gold evening light on the street outside the hotel, the look of someone who has found the thing they did not know they were looking for and intends to keep it. "It does help," he said, "considerably." She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her. And the garden was warm, and the roses were doing exactly what Grace Holt's roses had done, and what roses everywhere did when they were properly cared for. And somewhere in the house, Thomas James was arguing with Rosa about something of great importance to both of them. And Henry was probably asleep in the way that Henry slept through most of his siblings' disputes with serene indifference. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I want you to know that you are the best thing that was ever not planned," she said. "Everything about you arrived without a blueprint. And you are still the thing I am most glad of." He tightened his arm around her. "I feel the same," he said, "entirely and without reservation." They stood in the garden in the summer evening of 1884, and the light was long and warm, and everything that had happened had led to this, and this was enough. More than enough. It was, in fact, everything. Grace Holt came for Christmas that year and stayed 3 weeks, which was exactly long enough. She played cards with Thomas James and taught Rosa the names of every flower she could identify from Marcella's garden, and held Henry with the easy competence of a woman who had loved many children without having her own, and sat at the Ralston supper table in the evenings and talked and laughed and observed everything with those sharp eyes, and at the end of her visit said to Marcella privately, "You have built a very good life, my girl." "I had help," Marcella said. "You did," Grace agreed. "But you also knew what to do with it. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, most of it." Marcella walked Grace to the stage that would take her back to Soccer Row on a January morning, and they embraced for a long time, and Grace said, "Your mother would be so proud of you," which was the thing Marcella most needed to hear, and which she received the way she received all the best things, quietly and wholly, without deflection. She walked back to the house in the cold January morning, and came in to find Arthur at the kitchen table with coffee, and the government document he was currently working through, and Thomas James asleep on his arm, which happened occasionally when the boy had gotten up too early and followed his father downstairs. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at this, and felt the particular warmth that is only available to people who know that what they are looking at was not given to them, but was built, slowly and on honest terms, piece by careful piece. She sat down at the table and poured her coffee and picked up her own papers, and Arthur, without looking up, moved the document slightly to give her more room, and Thomas James stirred and went still again, and outside the window the January sky was beginning to pale toward something clear and bright, nothing like a bruise, nothing like an old wound. Just sky, just morning, just the day opening ahead of them. Together.